Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about how during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and their massive spy machine and spy network, how they planned and set out their plans to destabilize the democratic West, the capitalist democratic West. Now, they particularly targeted the English-speaking countries, and the main reason being is America, Britain, Canada, Australia. Back in the day, those countries accounted for nearly a third of total world wealth combined. So it was a good target to pick, and one language could apply to the whole thing. So they were all democratic societies, rule of law, that sort of thing. So they set about their planning set about particularly targeting those. Not that they left the other countries alone; they didn't. They went after them too, but particularly went after the English-speaking countries, which to some extent, a tougher nut to crack. They had quite homogenous societies. Not that there weren't disaffected folks, there were, but they had quite homogenous societies, quite a loyal, patriotic, nationalistic population and those sort of things. So firstly, they set about, I'll just take a moment actually to talk about the Cold War. What was the Cold War? Because some people, if you're under the age of 40, you probably don't really know what it is. The Cold War came about following the end of World War II. Now, the Russians, the Americans, and the British had prevailed in that armed struggle. And but the Soviet Union, the Russians, they had a communist system of government, and they had a very fervent commitment to export that communism all around the world, to assist revolutions wherever they may occur, and to foment revolution if they possibly could. So they were very active at running around trying to spread communism. They had a view, so internally in the Soviet Union, if they could find any citizen that didn't agree with communism, they'd threaten them, intimidate them, beat them up, imprison them, or kill them. So even one voice disagreeing was considered to be the equivalent of millions of voices. That's how they sort of viewed and how they were so insecure and perceived that the system was under threat all the time. Counter-revolutionaries were everywhere. Fascists were everywhere. And they used the term fascist to describe anyone that disagreed with or even had an issue or a question with the communist system. Now, they all believed capitalism was decadent and about to die and about to fall over, and that the whole world would be communist. They, or many of the ideologues at least, believed that. Now, the Soviet Union was a very substantial military power, so as was the United States. So really, it was the two superpowers were squaring off and trying to narc each other and annoy each other and niggle each other and intimidate each other. And whilst it wasn't open hostilities, they worked through proxies. So say there was a civil war in Africa, the Americans would supply weapons to one side, the Soviet Union would supply weapons to the other side in some regional conflict or local conflict. So all the fighting was done through proxies. Or general intimidation, tactics of intimidation and bluster and threat, such as the Russians putting missiles, nuclear missiles in Cuba and those sorts of things. So it was what it was called was the Cold War, a hot war being when both sides are actually shooting directly at each other. But given it was through intermediaries or proxies, then it was referred to generically as a Cold War, so war by other means. And that's what it was. And that went on from sort of around 1947, say, picking up speed into the 50s, and then through until the Soviet Union collapsed in between 1989 and 1991, and all the Soviet troops left Eastern Europe. So now, to some extent, the Cold War was the Soviets trying to protect themselves from what they saw as a possibility of being invaded. And there's always been a paranoia there amongst the Russians from that sort of thing. from the time of Napoleon and even earlier than that. So they had and still have today, by the way, a paranoia there. So some of this Cold War was about jostling for position and trying to shore up one's own position while trying to weaken the other side. If you have a look online, you can get President Kennedy's, I think it was his inaugural speech, where we'll bear any burden, oppose any foe, and this was very much into the teeth of what was seen as the Cold War at the time. And there were some pretty serious outbreaks of hostilities in the Cold War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and various other things, the insurgency in Malaya, Indonesia, there was a communist insurrection, these sorts of things. These were things that were part of the wider Cold War architecture. But anyway, the Russians, the Soviet Union, decided that they probably weren't going to be able to create revolution in the Western democracies. And if they did temporarily get control of, say, students at university, so they'd run on the streets to do riots, like the French students rioted in what was, I think it was 1968. You get things like that, but then it would die down fairly quickly, and it was very close, very much issue-based rather than broad-based. So there wasn't a wider ideological angle. So the Soviets took the view that they would have to be a bit more patient in undermining the West. They weren't going to create revolution where fanatics would run around and tear into the places of government and take over and that sort of thing, as the Bolsheviks, by the way, had in Russia in 1917. And the Bolsheviks were the name of a political party that had a communist policies. So so they put together a plan. So in the late 1960s, they sat down and crafted what they thought was a plan for undermining the West. Now, what's remarkable about this plan is that it's almost exactly the same, give or take, almost exactly the same as what's being used by the globalists to take over the West today and to crush democracy and the rule of law and due legal process. Now, the Soviets realized that democracy was just going to get in the way, so they had to neutralize it. They realized that the rule of law would get in the way, so they had to neutralize that or undermine it. So they looked at every facet of Western society in quite a bit of detail, thought, okay, we've either got to neutralize it, as in make it irrelevant, or we have to undermine it and we have to re-socialize it. So those were the things they decided to do. Now, I've gathered together some bits and pieces here that took quite a lot of running around, but and I'll read some of it to you here so that you'll get an idea of how it works. So I'm going to have to read through quite a bit here as I'm going, but they said they had to get into the party machinery, that is the Democrat Party administration machine, Republican Party, and to make sure that they could either they could make it impotent, and there was not a threat to what they were trying to do, or they could control it by making sure that only candidates they approved of could get placed in these positions. And they realised it would take decades probably to do it. And we see this in the Democrat and Republican parties, the amount of pro-globalist people in there. And they're unimpressive people. They're stooges, they're flunkies, they're bums. But that's what's needed. If you're going to take control of something, you need flunkies there that just do what the fuck they're told, and couldn't get a good gig like that anywhere. You're looking at people that would struggle to hold down a job on the refunds desk at Kmart or Walmart greeter's job or something like that. But now they're Congress men and women in federal parliament. Look at AOC, for Christ's sakes, part-time fucking barmaid. So I'm just going through reading through it here. So again, they're talking. They look at all the committees that form political parties and form the administration of political parties, and they make sure that people who are pro-Soviet or at least anti-capitalist and anti-Western social structure, they make sure those people are being appointed to these committees, and they're doing it very quietly. It's very much done in background. They're making sure that they've got the the human resources manager type thing is one of their people, and they're not frightened to move people out and give them nothing bullshit jobs and pay them very well to get rid of people that are just in the way, and then put one of their own people in. And they think they can do this without any sort of backlash or any problem. They can just gradually move out people who are in the middle ground or in the right. And they succeeded in doing this, and it was sort of, they went better than they thought. They thought they'd get more pushback. They thought they'd get more people. But in the end, it wasn't sort of done. As long as they rewarded the right people, or there was a whisper in someone's ear, we're going to expose you having done this or done that. So people that potentially could have stood up to it were compromised, or were bribed, or were just quietly given better jobs, or they waited till their retirement came and then someone else was put in. So it wasn't like a bloodbath or anything like that. It was done quietly, strategically, and in terms of treachery and duplicity, these guys are have got triple PhDs. They did it quite well, and they wanted hard left political activists and younger people who are more controllable and more suggestible. So. Now, by the night they were predicting, sort of by the mid 1970s, they would start to have majority control of pretty much all the committees and all the party, the party machinery, who selects who for standing in what election, planting people in the trade unions, and people, anything that could influence, people who are running museums, anything that could influence people's attitudes and the sort of information that would flow to them, that had to be controlled. This, of course, includes journalists and so on. Now, they had to do this because they said they needed to get around the nationalism and the loyalty that people had to their country and their class, say in the case of working class people, that sort of thing, and they had to get people to look at the world ideologically, then make an emotional commitment to that ideology and that form of socialism, and to constantly be plying with propaganda gradually, so that they would start to see capitalism as an evil in itself, and no explanation was needed. It just was. You don't have to prove it or anything like that. So the idea, if you get people stupid enough, and enough stupid people in the party, in the committees, then you can brainwash them over time. Say 10 to 15 years, that sort of stuff. So they were playing the long game here. And they called these people that they were turning agents of influence. And we see that today, the influences that they're created. The black lesbian that suddenly goes to university, even though she's got an IQ of 10 or something, goes to university, gets a PhD, then immediately gets numerous book deals and suddenly has her own column in the newspapers and this sort of thing. These are the manufactured poster people for the globalists, or in this case for the left, and they're just manufactured. They're not high IQ people. They're fucking morons, but they're just there because they can communicate to other black people, and then they can become key influencers, and they say what they're told to say when they're told to say it. So they're claiming they'll have enough people over this 15-year period, enough people to overwhelm those who are seeking democracy. But what they want there is, they say, well, democracy can still exist, but you can only vote for the people we say you can vote for, and those people do what we tell them to do. So they were happy for the illusion of democracy. Now, this in fact is what happened in the West. The political market has been shut down, and all the major parties all have the same policies. So this initiative or this plan of the Soviets it's been achieved. Soviets are gone, but other people have actually taken over the plan, taken over the infrastructure the Soviets created, and they're using it now for the globalist purpose. All that work, all that effort, all that planning, all those people being put in place, that it's still they're there now, but they're pushing the globalist thing. Now they're told to run around and say, all white people are bad, Nazis, fascists. So the message has been slightly changed. The talking points have been altered a little bit. But how many of these Black Lives Matter say we're dedicated to destroying capitalism, for example, or Antifa and all this sort of, capitalist is a fascist. Anyone who's capitalist is Hitler. But the big banks and the big money and the big end of town who are driving this and who control the media, they've been able to somehow keep themselves. No, it's that lower working class white guy. He's the problem. He's a Nazi. Us super rich guys who are pulling the strings and hiding behind the curtain and shouting out the talking points. It's not us. It's the others. And they've done rather well at doing that. They've really achieved it. How many demonstrations, things like that, and how many attacks do you see on the big banks and in the media? And you just don't. Now, again, I'm just continuing to read through this. So they called it the Parliamentary Road to communism or socialism. And they just accept, look, it's a stealthy takeover of the body politic, which is then used as an instrument to gain power and create impose a revolution on society, not at the point of a gun necessarily, not by armed revolution at least. But by taking over all the institutions and the body politic. The trade union movement plays a big part. They keep repeating this, that it's they claim if they don't sort of get what they want, they can always weaken the government through things like hysterical wage claims, declining productivity, inflation, forcing taxation up, and making sure the commercial sector is put under stress, encouraging monopolies to make things uncompetitive and put prices up. They had all this sort of stuff laid out, which is what we're seeing in the US today. So this was what they're mentioning here, Britain and so on. They say it's very important to take over to make sure that all the top brass in the police and in the army and so on are activists who will not prevent a government that's clearly mistreating and abusing the people, will not stop that government from acting, and will crush and put down any who attempt to oppose these illegitimate governments. They're particularly concerned that they're not sure the police and the army are really they're saying it's a longer program to get them on side, and they'll just have to go through a long program of replacing all the senior army and armed forces officers with people who are sympathetic to the Soviet cause, which today would be the globalist cause. I mean, look at fucking Mark Milley, for Christ's sakes. Gee whiz. You wouldn't put that guy in charge of cleaning the floor. And gee whiz, he's there at the top of the tree, and very much pro-globalist. They talk here about stacking votes. If you can't win the vote legitimately, even if you've put all your flunkies in there, just rig the vote. I mean, why bother? If you control the media, then you can make sure that that information goes out. That no, the vote was clean. Nothing wrong with that. Which again, we've seen that recently. So this goes back again to the 1960s. This was the Soviet blueprint for undermining and taking over the West, the United States, Britain. The United States and Britain in particular were talked about more than anything else. Undermining the courts. This is where they say they've got to make sure that judges and magistrates and all these sort of people in the courts, particularly the chief justices and in the higher courts, that they're all stacked with people who are sympathetic to the Soviet position. And of course, again today, that's happening in the West. There are now, half plus of all the judges in the West are sympathetic to the globalist cause. When I say sympathetic to the globalist cause, all white men are fascist Nazis. We live in a patriarchy surrounded by Nazis. Capitalism is inherently bad and unjust. Black people, minorities are all oppressed. We should have mass migration. These third world illiterate peasants have the right to come to rich countries and freelide off the locals. These things are rights. Climate change was going to kill us all, and so on and so forth. So these are the sort of things. And the climate was mentioned here. They obviously didn't think it was going to be such a big deal as it is now. So that's probably more something that's owned by. It was probably in the early days of being whipped up into a frenzy when the Soviet Union fell over, but it certainly has been gleefully and eagerly taken over by the globalists. You've got to wonder if the globalists actually kept the personnel, the human resources, the assets, the human assets, where they kept them on payroll and used them, because it's gone from the Soviet plan to destabilize the West to the globalist plan to destabilize the West. It's been almost seamless. I don't know if there's even a blip in between, is there? I don't think so. So they're talking about the Democrats in the US and the Labour Party in Britain, and they're saying that that they're confident they can infiltrate both those parties and turn them into Soviet stooges, just rubber stamp for Soviet policy as part of how they can undermine the West. So they go on here to sort of. They even talk about like the local council government and county government to use those county council type governments to train and blood activists to then move them into a bigger political sphere later on. It's a nice, quiet, sort of out of the way method to train these people who later on will be used to destroy the West. So they've done. I mean, their manifesto, if you could call it that, would be to privatise all medicine and hospitals, with the interest in compulsory vaccines and things like that. I mean, where have we heard that recently? No private school or private college or anything like that can be allowed. It's the entire private sector in this education, higher education, must be gone. Everything must be controlled by the state. And they're quite open here that only teachers and lecturers and so on that are approved of as being activists, ideological activists, can be allowed to teach. No one else can be allowed to teach. You just can't have it. And again, we're seeing that today. Look at the ideological madness in the teachers there. They do the usual thing, by the way, of saying that the people who are most likely to listen to this siren song are Jews, academics, and gay lesbians. Those are the tags. So the trifecta is like a Jewish lesbian teacher. You don't get better than that. That's absolute. That's ideological gold as far as the Soviet activists were concerned. No money can be moved around without the approval of the government. the top 1,000 corporations all have to be nationalised. They want to either, if they can't successfully infiltrate the Senate and that sort of thing, they want to get rid of it and just have a one people's house, as they call it. They want to nationalise the media and make sure that they have appropriate editorial guidance, as they call it here, which means that every newspaper, every TV station must have a ideological commissar in charge. I mean, we see that today. I mean, 95% of the media say exactly the same thing, all the same thing. They all say exactly the same thing about, Nazis are everywhere. Jussie Smollett's been horribly abused by fascists and Nazis. I mean, they talking point propaganda, and they're all on the same page. So that's effectively happened as well. Yeah, just reading through, just think how many of these things have happened. The nationalisation, not so much, but have a look at all the big companies. They're being given almost monopoly power in their respective segments and niches and so on. And not all of them, but many of them, or big government contracts, or a mix of the above. They're allowed to bring in cheap labour from peasant economies and that sort of thing. They're allowed to bypass market forces, artificially depress wages, all of this sort of stuff. So effectively, the top 1,000 companies, say in the US, they all more or less are in bed with the government and in bed with the media, and they all. You go to any of these big companies now, all they talk about is how many black lesbians they've just hired. So they've effectively been nationalised for the ideological cause, which is what the Soviets were talking about here. National broadcasting of news should all be controlled. There shouldn't be any broadcasting outside of ideological governmental control. Now, here's there should be a national control body to administer or reform, as they've got here in brackets, the courts and just the whole legal system generally. Now they're going to undermine the legal system by saying it's unfair to minorities and all the black people are killed all the time. That sort of stuff, which includes the police, by the way, which is what you see now. Again, then this is I'm reading this is from the 1960s, for goodness sake. And they've got a policy here to remove what they call unsound judges, and to the vote should be, any voting or anything like that should be abolished. Appeal procedures and just due legal process, rule of law, and to be the rule of law and due legal process to be replaced with ideological law. So even though you may not have done anything bad to the black lesbian, it doesn't matter, because black lesbians are an oppressed class and you're a straight white male. So your mere existence is oppression, and therefore you're guilty ideologically, even though you've done nothing wrong and committed no crime. You're still damn fucking guilty, you damn fascist Nazi. So that's and they're wanting to change the legal system to reflect that. So and to re-educate all judges so that they can be what's referred to here as socially aware. And how much have you heard that term as well? So they can have special sort of control bodies in the army and make sure that all soldiers and police officers attend socially aware training. It's again ideological training. That's happened. That's been happening for years now. So again, the same thing. It's all. But the police will not bother with a murder or a robbery, but they'll go chasing someone for using the wrong pronoun for a transgender person. I mean, this is the madness. But this is what they were prescribing here. This is what the Soviets were trying to do and were trying to put in place. I would argue that they were half the way there when the Soviet Union fell over, and the globalists have just taken over that whole mechanism and all those policies and just turned it for globalist use. So that's getting rid of nuclear weapons. So that's about it, I guess. But that's that's my take on things. But have a think about it yourself and have a little look around, and particularly look at the Soviet activism during that Cold War, particularly say 1960 to 1975, that time frame. And I think you'll find that they were putting in place, the young law clerks who were in the offices of the Supreme Court of the United States. They would have been in their early 20s, were back then. But today they're chief justices on appeal courts and so on. And they were the activists of the young activists, the wild-eyed activists of their time, that wanted to change the system to ensure that there was equity. And without realising that once you go down that path of pursuing equal outcomes and equity, that the rule of law, due legal process, evidence, facts, it all has to go out the window. But that was part of what the Soviets were doing, that once they can get rid of facts and get rid of reality, then these Western societies will crumble anyway, and they can just sort of walk in and take control, which I believe is happening today. You've been with Tastas today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.